evening, everyone. My name is Rita Hicks, and on behalf of the League of Women Voters of Houston Education Fund, I'd like to welcome you to Public Affairs Public Access. We have a really fun show planned for you tonight, and hopefully also very informative. We've already started the fun because tonight, rather than our usual music, we have a composition that was put together by none other than Houston Media Source's own Mark Pirtle. And you'll notice we're also having a little bit of fun with the backgrounds. They are very on theme tonight. Check this out. And so if you haven't guessed, we are talking data. In fact, specifically, we are talking open data. And it's such a relevant conversation immediately post-Harvey and what we saw the city do, in and around technology to solve problems for the city. Very exciting conversation for tonight. So let me introduce you to our guests for tonight. First, we have frequent flyer Jeff Reichman of January Advisors. We also have with us tonight Sindhu Menon, who is an Enterprise Data Officer with the City of Houston. Thanks so much for joining us. And we might have an additional guest joining us later, and if he pops in, I'll introduce him then. So can we, before we hop into the subject, can we just take a minute and let each of you tell our viewers at home what you do around data? Jeff, we'll start with you.
Sure. Well, my name is Jeff Reichman, and I do three things. The first is I wear a T-shirt for the Houston Astros, Clutch City, world champions of baseball. Happened just last night. The second thing I do is I run a consulting firm called January Advisors that works with data and technology and public sector and nonprofit clients. And the third thing that I do is I run a nonprofit called Sketch City, which is a community of thousands of data nerds and map nerds and policy nerds who come together to advocate for tech and data in government. So that's my background.
Right. Well, and full disclosure, I work with Jeff on Sketch City all the time. Love, love, love it. So, Sindhu, we've only just met tonight. Tell me about you.
Absolutely. So I haven't worn a Astros t-shirt, but cheers to Astros. I am the Enterprise Data Officer for the City of Houston, and my role involves coming up with the policies, standards, and everything that is required for the foundation to set up a successful open data practice.
And can you tell us a little bit about how your particular segment of City of Houston originated?
So this is prior to my time. In the year 2012, that's my understanding, and Jeff has been much more closer to this since the beginning, so he can keep me honest here.
All right.
So 2012 is when Mayor Parker, there were discussions, and she laid the foundation and agreed upon city moving towards open data.
Yeah.
And
oh, sorry, go ahead.
yes, since then we have evolved that practice, and September of 2014 is when we released our first open data policy, an AP, that details what this open data practice at the city would be, what is my role as an enterprise data officer, how would the governance structure be set up, and how would city operate in the open data space.
Right. So just let's talk about roles at the table here. We have Sindhu, who works with the city. She's a city representative building policy. And then with Jeff, we have an SME in how the private sector and nonprofit interact with the city's data in order to try to solve problems. So I want to mention at this point, before we hop into the actual content, that it is a call-in show. So if you hear anything that you want to hear more about, you have questions, you want to learn something about open data tonight, you can call us at 713-807-1794. So everyone who has watched this more than once knows that I am not a tech person. I find myself adjacent to tech often, but it's not a language that I speak. So for the people who are watching who might be like me, Jeff, tell me, what is open data?
Open data is the tech nerd's form of government transparency. So it's making the data that the government collects during its normal course of business that's not confidential. There's all sorts of stuff that the government collects. Maybe you want to know how much they paid in electricity for this fire station over here. I don't know why you'd want to know that, but there are reasons why you might want to know. There's so much data that they collect that's not confidential. It's about releasing it in a way that can be machine readable. So oftentimes when governments first started publishing information on the internet, they do it using PDFs, and now it's all about making that data accessible and up to date.
Okay, so this is maybe a more granular question, but how with the city of Houston, because we'll stay there because that's your wheelhouse. How does a city like Houston decide what kinds of data to collect?
What kinds of data to collect?
Right.
That might be more of a question for Sindhu because they manage so many different applications in the course
Right.
of business.
So, so we have some core public services, for example, 311. We know that 311 is a data set that public would be interested in. How is city performing against some services? So the decisions as to what data are we collecting are based upon what services we provide.
I see. I have to imagine that with the number of services provided by a city as large as Houston, the data sets you could collect if you tried to do everything all at once would be just overwhelming.
It is.
So how, if you know, and I'm asking kind of, again, very granular questions, but how, aside from giving thought to what the public might be interested in seeing, how do you prioritize what data to collect versus things that you might like to collect, but you just don't have the resources to focus on that right now?
Well, it depends upon the number of requests we get. So if there is a demand for a certain kind of data set, or we think, like example, Harvey happened, and we know that there is a demand for Harvey-related data set, and we want to make sure that the community has the resources to do their analysis, to come up with, either solutions or what happened, predictive, all kind of analytics, then we focus on that area, make it a priority. Again, the priority is driven by the mayor's office as well. We work very closely with the mayor's office of performance and innovation. So they also drive our priority. So it's basically, the challenge we have is the resources. So though there is a lot of demand for open data, and we know that we want to engage with the community, the amount of resources we have, that puts a challenge in front of us.
I'm sure that's right. And Jeff, you've actually been in a position over the course of your various projects of finding places where there are holes in the data and having that dialogue with the city about collecting better data. So can you, for the average person who might be interested in learning something specific from the city, can you talk us through a little bit about how that process works?
Sure. Well, in the beginning, there's a little bit of just taking inventory and having a better understanding of what the city does. Data isn't useful unless you know what's driving it. So the city has so many different activities that it performs, and so many different systems that track those activities that I kind of work backwards. I start to see what data is available, and I'll talk to people in the city. You can make written requests. So anytime you email a city person, that's part of what could become a public record, and it's a written information request that has to be responded to in a certain way. So if you're curious about something, I'm sure that the city probably doesn't want to get tons and tons of requests, but if you want to know about something that the city does, you can ask them, and they have to respond. So that's where it starts, and then, as the city starts to release information, maybe you get a data set released. The city just released an incredible data set related to Harvey damage, and it was a huge win for open data, and Sindhu's team really just worked incredibly hard along with planning and GIS to get it done. That then gets released and people start using it and saying, it would be great if it also had this, or here's how we used it. So it's a really good feedback loop around when the city's able to release useful data for the citizens, and citizens then go do something cool with it, or do something useful or insightful. That can really help grow an open data program and provide better quality data in the future.
So this is very interesting to me. So just my background is legal. Any of you who've spent a few minutes with me know that, but maybe Sindhu, you didn't. So I am familiar with the open records request process. Most cities have them. A lot of other governmental entities have them too. So that's one process by which you can achieve what you're talking about, which is to collect request from the city data that it collects. But what happens when there is something sort of ancillary that you discover through your research is not being collected? What is that? How does that dialogue differ from just an open records request?
So when you're, if I'm hearing you right, when you discover something that the city should be doing, but they're not necessarily doing it?
Something you think they should.
Yeah, well, I tell them I think you should be doing this. Whether they listen is whether it's the right answer, I don't know. What I do know is that the way in which the city works is it's a well-oiled machine, and it does what it does very, very well and to a very enterprise caliber. And to Sindhu's point, it does operate with limited resources. When I find something that I think the city should be doing, I start doing it, and try and provide a model. Like when we do a hackathon and we say, hey, it would be great if there was an adopt a drain program where you can pick am I jumping ahead? You can pick a drain and clear it out before a rainstorm, and the city should do this. If we brought the idea to the city, they'd say, well, that's great, we should be doing this, but that costs money. But when we build the product and then we show the demand and we say, hey, this is a great idea and it's 99% of the way there, we need help finishing it off and maintaining it, then it becomes a different conversation. So for people who want to see the city do a better job in their estimation, they should start by prototyping it.
So we're gonna deep dive into applications of data. Don't you worry. But I do have another question, sort of just related to the pool of data that's available, because you obviously have been involved in developing this policy for a while now, and Jeff, you have been involved in open data in the city since the beginning when Cindy was talking about Mayor Parker's prioritizing an open data policy. So can you talk a little bit about how the quality of data how you've observed the quality of data change over those, say, 5 years?
Sure. Well, when we started with some very low-hanging fruit type of data sets, stuff that was very non-controversial, things that were helpful. 311 data, for example, was one of the very first things that was opened up and made available, and that's super helpful and used in lots of different ways. But since then, I've really noticed a change in the way in which employees look at open data and how it gets prioritized. The city has over 20,000 employees, and nobody really has to care about anything except their immediate job. And open data is never anybody's immediate job. And so it's through the efforts of all of the employees across all of these different departments that all kind of come across Sindhu's desk and Sindhu's team that have been instrumental in making this program just a whole lot better.
So Sindhu, I have to imagine, in addition to actually crafting the policy, you have a pretty hefty education component within city departments too, just around what open data is and why they should care about it in their day-to-day job and what they need to do in order to implement the policy. Can you tell me a little bit about what that's like?
Absolutely, and you're absolutely right. There is an education involved, not just with open data. So we just came up with a policy around data classification. So Jeff talked about the sensitive data. We have private data, which includes the social security number and health records and all those. Then we have this data which is limited to the city. We would not expose it to others. So so we are going through an exercise of educating folks about understanding what are these different classifications of data, and among that, in that process, we go about and letting them know, when you think of data, think of it, if it does not fall under these 3 classifications, then that's something which can be opened up. So when you're analyzing your data sets, think about what among those data sets can be shared. So that's what is our first step towards educating.
And I have to imagine when you're working across multiple different kinds of departments within a city, you're dealing with not only all different kinds of data, but also all different kinds of employees collecting that data. And have you found that the policy and sort of the explanation of the different kinds of data you're talking about has been translatable across departments?
So far, because this is something which I think has now become a necessity all across. I'm talking about in general in the organizations where everyone is interested in understanding, okay, can I make this open, right? Or I don't want to make it open, but I don't know how do I classify this as private. So where does it fall under? So it's a very I have not had any oppositions or anyone trying to challenge me on the policy. So it has been very accepted across the city?
Well, and I will use myself as an example of this because I think sort of the average engineer that builds things anyway, when you explain the importance of data in the construction process of some project, it's like, okay, I get it, and here's why you need my data. But when you talk to a lawyer or someone in compliance who's really afraid of any document going out the door, there's a lot more hesitancy until you can put some very sort of clear dimensions around, like, this is what stays in-house, and this is what is okay to go out. It might make someone like me, like, a little bit more okay with the process.
Yeah.
And certainly working with Jeff has made me look at data in a different way, but I have to, with as many attorneys as the city has to employ, I have to imagine that was a pretty hefty education load for you.
It has been, and our attorneys have been great. They have helped us out, and we have gone through a lot of review process before we release that policy, and probably that's why the acceptance is pretty high.
Good. Well, that's really good. Okay, so we kind of talked about the different kinds of data available, quality of data, and we already started touching on it a little bit, but I'm going to ask the other very basic question, which is, why is open data important? Jeff?
That's a great question. It's important. There's so many reasons why it's important. The number one reason is that it's the best way to understand what the city does and how it works and how it's performing. And anytime some commenter on the Houston Chronicle or somebody on Swamp Lot has an opinion about government's performance, they should be able to go back and say, here's the numbers, here's the report card, here's what happened. So it's definitely an asset that is necessary in order to have reasonable checks and balances on how your taxpayer dollars are spent. That's the highest possible level. It's facts. But it's important to the tech community as well, because there's a lot that the city can and cannot do. They can and cannot do it because of liability. They sometimes can't do things because they're resource constrained. And by sharing the data, that fundamental building block, they can rely on the community and other professionals to be able to assist them with more niche apps and programs and studies that they don't have the full-time capacity to handle.
This is the resource constraint you were mentioning before. So when you have someone like Jeff who, with the technical skills to work on data that you are collecting, that you have departments collecting, what does that look like? If you, does it happen that you have a problem develop internally and then you reach out and say, hey, can you help us solve this?
Well, so that's a difficult question to answer. So yes,
It was not meant to be.
So the resource constraint that Jeff mentioned is one of them. We have another resource constraint where, to develop these data sets, we need resources. We need resources to do the analysis. We need the resources to understand the classification of the data sets, working with the departments, and the different things that go around building the data sets. So that's one constraint. So having somebody like Jeff who's interested in the data set, again, you're talking about the sensitivity of these data sets which are sitting in the city environment. So unless we have a contract in place, it's difficult for me to engage Jeff in coming and touching those. And then again, the contract puts some liability on Jeff's side to make sure that the classifications are maintained. And only the data set that needs to be made public is made public.
So, and then Jeff, in your work through Sketch Study and also just the community through hackathons, I've heard you talk about examples where you identified a place where the city wasn't collecting data or the county wasn't collecting data, and so you started collecting it for them. What does the handover of data like that look like? Because presumably you want the city or the county to have that resource too once you've collected it.
Sure. Well, sometimes it's just a matter of taking the data that they already have and giving it back to them in a way that's easier to understand or easier to process. I could list a number of data projects that we've worked on, such as scraping arrest data every day. Every day the county jail publishes who's in their jails. And it's all the different agencies that have arrested people, and these people have made it down to the county jail, and they publish a report. And every day they overwrite that report. So a couple of years ago, I wrote a script and started collecting that information. And that ended up being really helpful to better understand one of the major campaign issues of 2016. If you recall, the effective decriminalization of marijuana and the better understanding of who is getting arrested for low-level amounts of marijuana, how many people are getting arrested, where do they live generally, and what's the socioeconomic background of these people. And what you find is that over 80% of them come from middle-class and working-class neighborhoods. So there's lots of hidden clues in this data. We did another project with the Texas Criminal Justice Coalition, taking data from the county clerk around, I believe it was county clerk, around criminal court dispositions over the last 6 years, and taking 800,000 cases and starting to slice and dice it and say, what are the bail trends based on race? What are the sentencing trends based on where you're assigned, whether it's Texas State Jail or the county jail? And are certain judges harsher than others to certain types of people for certain crimes? So being able to give defense attorneys, prosecutors, lawyers the ability to interact with that 800,000 record data set is kind of what we try to do. So to answer your question, oftentimes it's just about taking that data and making it into a different package for them.
Repurposing it.
Yes.
So I mentioned I'm an attorney, and I have actually found that when you're dealing across different courts, there's actually a significant disconnect in the data. So the county court system is separate from the district court system, which is kind of connected to the family court system, but the searches that you put together don't always return consistent data. I have to imagine with as many departments and segments of government that you work across, you come across that disconnect a lot. So how does that potential disconnect between various departments collecting different kinds of data, various segments of government collecting different kinds of data, how does that play with what you're trying to do with an open data policy that's supposed to govern the entire city?
And that's where the governance comes into play. So we have the different departments. You said, example, Harvey. Almost all the departments who provide public services are trying to collect the Harvey data and provide, they're providing the analysis of what they see on this data. So the governance structure, the data set which Jeff just referred, which we have made open data for Harvey, we had all the different departments come together and discuss the data sets that they had in place and then find the common denominator across that and then make those public. So that's primarily driven through governance.
Okay, very interesting. Can we talk a little bit more about the kinds of things that can be built with data collected from the city?
Sure. Well, I'm sure that there are internal projects that you all have built, dashboards and things that drive performance improvement. There's a roundtable, a data nerds roundtable that meets every other month of city employees, and I've been a fly on the wall every once in a while that I think is really cool. So I think Sindhu can talk more about those internal collaborations. For what we do with city data, first of all, the city provides a fundamental layer for every geospatial analysis we do. The boundaries of the county, the boundaries of the city, the census data of the city, maintaining Lambert's grid, civic clubs, super neighborhoods, city council districts, HISD, like their GIS team manages all those boundaries. And while those boundaries don't change all the time, they change infrequently. That's the fundamentals that we use for analysis for advocacy, because we might want to know what are all the daycare centers in this HISD trustee district, and who do you call for this one or that one. So there's that fundamental stuff. But then there's lots of cool stuff that can be built based on departmental data. And I think that from what I've seen, some departments more than others are more willing to publish their data. So it's individual kind of department, it's up to the individual department heads. But we've seen some really good participation from planning, from HIST HITS, the IT services component for the City of Houston, finance division, the controller's office is really open with all of their audit information. So there's lots of interesting, cool stuff that can be built. My favorite thing that we've built over the last couple of years is a Twitter bot that tweets out air quality warnings. So the Texas Commission for Environmental Quality publishes air quality readings every 15 minutes from their gas chromatographs around town. And every once in a while, there's an exceedance. There's too much benzene in the air, and you would never know. So what we do is we scrape that data every 15 minutes and write it to a database, and we set a threshold, and when it exceeds that threshold, it shoots out a tweet. And that Twitter feed is the way in which I stay in daily contact with air quality data in Houston. So sometimes it's about making data more accessible, sometimes it's about making it more interpretable, and sometimes it's just fun stuff that, because you care about air quality.
And what kinds of projects are you working on internally?
Quite a few. Not exactly. So we work on, our model is self-service analytics. So we're trying to enable the departments to come.
So let's have a vocabulary lesson there, because not everyone at home knows what self-service analytics are.
So like I mentioned earlier, we are not, we in the sense my organization under HITS is not staffed or does not have enough staffing resources to support the entire city's demand. There's a lot of demand across the city for analytics. And cool analytics, really cool analytics, something similar to what Jeff just described, quite a few things happening at the city. So we are moving towards, how do we enable the departments to do their own analytics by using their resources. So these departments, like planning, like PWE, like, some of the other departments have really good data analysts, scientists, and the database administrators and all that, different roles that is needed for building up an analytical platform. So we give them the foundation by letting them know, okay, these are the principles by which you should operate,
Okay.
and give them the tools, give them the training required through the tools, and then they are able to go and do what they need to do. So I didn't name the projects because there's a lot going on the data space there at the city.
What can you talk to us about maybe what your favorite project that you're working on right now is?
Well, open data is one of my favorite projects, and immediately what comes into my head is these Harvey analytical initiatives that are in progress. So these are the ones which.
Yeah.
Well, so let's talk about Harvey, because it's kind of dominated our year this year, at least the second half of the year. I don't know, maybe the World Series now dominates the second half of our year. Let's say that's more positive. But, the scale of that is something that having been in Houston for over a decade, can't recall any kind of response that compares, not just from a hurricane perspective, but just in general, something that big that the city had to tackle that rapidly. Jeff, talk to us a little bit about some of the work that the tech community did to rally. And while we're all stuck at home trying to wait for the water to recede so we can get out and actually be doing whatever it is we were doing out in the community.
For sure. There was so much that happened, and there are so many heroes from Harvey that I'll try to keep it brief and chronological. While it was still raining, Matthew Marchetti from what became Houston Harvey Rescue and now Crowdsource Rescue built a map that you could drop a pin and say, hey, I need help getting rescued. At the same time, the Zello app was starting to take off. We probably have heard all about that. But these two tools came together to help dispatch boats into the rivers of Houston and save people. As the rain was letting up, these people had to go somewhere, and so they went into shelters. And the amount of people that overwhelmed these shelters was overwhelming. The Red Cross had a list of about 20 or 30 shelters on the website, and a lot of us in the community, in our tech community, were volunteering, physically serving food or, helping with supplies at the George R. Brown. And this college student, this amazing guy named Niall Dixon, built a text bot because he was looking at the Red Cross list and he said, if I didn't have power, there's no way I would know where to go or anything like that. So I'm going to take this list and I'm going to make it so that you can text your address and it'll tell you the closest shelter. From there, Amanda Shee, who had volunteered at the George R. Brown, came home and said, there's lots of things that we can do to help people find shelters. So she built a shelter map. Other people had started kind of improving that map, and and expanding upon it. And what eventually happened is we realized that all this data needed to stay in sync. It needed to, if you're going to a shelter, you want to make sure no matter where you got that information is up to date. So we built an API for it, and that API helped people crowdsource information about shelters. They would call, they'd say, are you accepting people? Do you have medical personnel? What do you need? Do you need food? Do you need water? So it started to evolve into needs. Over Labor Day weekend, before the official tech platform was stood up, we put out a Texas muck map, which people could say, hey, I have a home that needs mucking out, and I have tools, I'm ready to muck. So we helped them connect and migrated that over into the sign-up platform. So there were lots of little things. My favorite tool that came out of Harvey that was built by our community was reportyourhours.com. FEMA provides reimbursement dollars for volunteer hours. So we took a paper form and we digitized it and made it available. So there were lots of really interesting things that our community built. There were probably 3 or 4 dozen active developers in the community, with orders of magnitude more than that in our Slack and just chiming in from throughout the world. And we're really grateful for the help that the veterans of Hurricane Sandy, Hurricane Katrina, and later, the help of people from around the world, Irma, Maria, Mexico City, that it created a community of disaster tech responders that hopefully will continue to live on.
So all the while, all these amazing things are happening, and we're going to go back and talk about some of that in a little bit more detail. Just you wait. But the only way that it's working is because it's working in sync with what the city and the county are doing to respond. So talk to me about the conversation that's happening between the critical work that's being done by our city and this, amazing tech community that is sort of churning projects out as quickly as they can from the data that they can collect.
Well, I think I'm not very deeply engaged in those initiatives, so I think Jeff works closely with the Mayor's Office of Innovation and Performance on that. So mine is more towards, once the data is identified or the departments coming together, that's when I get engaged.
So I understand. You're coming in on the back end. So
Yes.
all of these projects are operating. They're, doing what they're doing to collect information all along the way. And it's all coming to you in one form or another. And you're having to figure out how to make all of it work together, make sense of it, figure out how to categorize it, as you were mentioning.
Working closely with the departments as well as Jeff's team.
With an end to, is there thought being given to what's going to be done with the data next?
I didn't get the question.
Well, so you're collecting data all along the way, presumably so that you can put together sort of lessons learned, a plan for the future, much like what we did, post Katrina and Rita, and then again post Ike. And I presume with those earlier hurricanes, simply because the technology was not the same as it was today, we couldn't collect data in the same way. So now we have a city that's presumably now working on a new lessons learned process, of which data is an integral part. So can you talk to us a little bit about what that might look like?
Absolutely. So, example, Harvey by the Numbers. That's a website that came up as a result of different departments coming together and providing the data. That is available. It's available, publicly available, and the data sets. Again, the data sets that can be made open, which are not sensitive, which does not have sensitive information, which does not identify individuals, we make it public. The rest of the data is available with us, but for internal use by the right team members in the city.
So, Cindy brought up a topic that I have wondered about through this whole thing, and either one of you can, feel free to jump in. But when we're talking Harvey in particular, you have some people who had just a very broad group of needs. Some people lost homes. They might also have lost the schools their kids go to, but they might also have been injured. They might have, food needs. And a lot of those things are just kind of things that are easy wraparound services, but some of them are sensitive information. Some of them are things that HIPAA would cover. And, I feel like there's got to be some, sensitivity around wanting to make sure people are cared for in the aftermath, but also, you're collecting data that is sensitive in nature. And how does that, potential sensitivity of the data factor into, what's being done with the data now?
That's a really good question. From the crowdsourced data perspective, when people give their information over, they're just looking for help. They're not saying, I'm agreeing to this administrative end user licensing agreement that you can advertise hurricane relief supplies to me, or something like that. So there's less rules governing what we do. There's greater liability, and as a result, we can do a whole lot more in experimental worlds of peer-to-peer helping than, say, an official government response. And so that, I think that works alongside the more kind of vetted, sensitive, protected approach. I think what you asked around needs is a good question for Baker Ripley, which stood up the largest shelter down at NRG Stadium. And I think across the board, I can't speak for Baker Ripley, and I certainly can't speak for the city, but I think across the board, Harvey was a data struggle. There's a lot of people collecting data. There's not a lot of people sharing data for obvious reasons. And if there's something that we can learn from it, it's better ways to provide pathways of communication so that we're not going to duplicate effort, so that we can get to all the things that we need to get to, and that we can track things that might disappear, such as debris information or damage information that's so critical when we stop thinking with our hearts in the humanitarian side and start thinking with our heads and saying, we need some money from the federal government to help rebuild, and we need to get a good data-driven case for what that means.
Well, speaking as someone who does quite a lot in the civic space, I know that it can be hard sometimes to put down that heart piece and focus on the business side of things, but as you mentioned, it is quite critical. So I have to imagine that some of the siloing you're describing, though, is simply because you have so many different people working on different things at once, and they aren't necessarily projects that are talking to one another, and the different organizations that are running shelters are also collecting data, but not necessarily in a way that that communicates back and forth. So how do you take this kind of fragmented collection of information, assuming everyone is willing to share, and put it together in a usable way?
It's a really good question, and it's something that's not an easy answer because there's a lot of moving parts to this. When we think about the continuum of what it means to get rescued, to go to a shelter, to find temporary housing, permanent housing, and all the needs that go along with it, there's lots of different service providers. I think one of the big projects that we'd like to see get off the ground here in Houston is a project called Open Referral, which is a data standard for service providers that works with 211 data that will enable us, if implemented, it will enable us to, one, have more current and up-to-date service provider data. So, this place closed, this place open, that kind of thing. And two, have a data standard that feeds out all the service provider information in a machine-readable way, an API, that can, three, allow us to build applications that are really useful and niche. For example, if you're an LGBTQ youth who is experiencing temporary homelessness, where do you go? Or if you are an undocumented immigrant and you want to go somewhere to get services that does not ask for a photo ID, where do you go? There's a number of these use cases that when we're able to standardize the data in a way that makes sense, then we can start to build the applications to solve for them.
Mm-hmm. So, Sindhu, Jeff did mention, a lot of what he's describing, I would put in the bucket of city can't do's, right? Not only because of a lack of resources, but also because there's just a little bit more freedom with the information when you don't have the confines of government to be concerned with and governance to be concerned with. But at the same time, I have to, I'm hearing you say basically what you want to do is be able to harness that data and use it for the city. How does that interplay? In other words, does part of your governance address the topic of, you might be receiving data from someone who's collecting it without any regard for whether it's sensitive information or not, because due to the emergent nature of what they're trying to do, whereas you as a city do have to be concerned about HIPAA compliance and other things like that. I imagine that's a tension, and is that something that you're working through with the city's data policies?
Yes, we are, and
Okay.
that's why I said the first stage of that was to create a data classification and making the city understand, or the different departments. We have a data technology working group that has been formed inside the city, and then they did the data nerds group. So we are socializing that data classification across the board. So that's the foundation over which we can now build how do we share the data with other entities. So it's not just the community that's asking. There are other research organizations that reach out to us, and other public sector organizations that reach out to us. It makes it, now we're working on a data access policy. So the reason why we're working on these policies is it makes it easier for us to interact with the community and other agencies that are requesting the data sets to do the good things that Jeff is referring to.
And so what the city is doing in open data through your group, is it unique? Are other large cities doing something similar? And if they are, do you communicate back and forth best practices and things like that?
We do, and it's not unique. So open data has been there for, I think, for some time now. I don't want to give the year and all that, so it has been there for some time. And I think most of the cities do, large cities I'm talking about, do have a open data policy and a program in place. Yes, we do talk to cities, like we talk not just in United States, we're talking to other cities such as Toronto, we're talking to some external cities as well to understand what are the good things that they're doing and what can we adopt. I would not say we are modeling against another city. We want to be unique, and we want to be more successful than most of our cities. So that's the goal.
Yeah, absolutely.
Can I add to that?
go ahead.
That in a city like Houston, with a strong mayor form of government and a chief executive, it requires political leadership to make open data a reality. It doesn't have to happen. And it was because of Mayor Parker's vision and now Sheriff, former City Councilman Ed Gonzalez's vision to get the policy going so that it can be socialized over time. The first time you hear the word hackathon, it sounds weird, but the 400th time you hear hackathon, it's just another word. And then through that top-down buy-in, it takes heroes behind the city walls like Sindhu, who are saying, how do we do this? How does this get done? And I'm outside saying, I want all this data. I'm going to do cool stuff with it. Why can't you give this to me yesterday? But I try to take a point of view from what it looks like inside the city and all of this governance and privacy, and it really is a Herculean effort across the board, from the politicians, from the department directors, from the managers, and from the people doing the hard work. So I don't want to underestimate at all the amount of effort that the city has put in to create an open data program that's going to thrive and last.
So that segues beautifully into the next question I was going to ask you, which is kind of what's next? Where's the city headed next with its open data policy development?
So I do want to state that, I think Jeff did refer to it in one of his comments earlier, that open data is not the primary mission of the city. It is one of the goals. We want to keep the community engaged, and this is one of the ways for community engagement, but it's not one of the primary goals. So yes, city supports it. We want to move forward. My goal is, consistently educate and bring the departments on board and continue to refresh the data sets and add new data sets based upon the demand of the community. But that's not, I cannot take up all the different requests and, probably make a promise saying that, city will have 100 data sets in this 1 year and all. So it's slow and steady. That's the goal. So keep our existing portal consistent and refresh in a timely manner, keep adding open data sets as they come up or we identify them based upon either the community or the demand of the other entities which play a role in prioritizing, and consistently grow the program.
So that brings up another question. Jeff mentioned earlier the city's innovation office, and we've actually had Jesse Bounds be a guest of ours on a different episode of Public Affairs, Public Access. So can you talk to me a little bit about how your team interacts with the innovation office?
We work very closely together.
On what kinds of things? So,
On almost all the data initiatives, we work very closely with Jesse's team. Jesse's team is a great supporter of this program. They make us aware of what's coming, if they hear of any demand for data sets, they help us out quite a bit. So they are a great partner. We work very closely with them.
So it's their job to know what's coming next and let you know so that you can start working on how the policy needs to be shaped in order to handle it.
Well, they are one of the sources through which we learn.
I shouldn't make it sound like any one piece of a giant city government is in charge of anything, because that's simply not the case. So I feel like we've talked around this question a little bit, Jeff, but for the average person who might be interested in what we're talking about and want to get involved, what can someone in the community do?
Well, that's a good question. First, it depends on your skill set, but we have a giant catcher's mitt called Sketch City. And Sketch City, if you go to sketchcity.org, is a meetup that meets every week where you meet other people who you can be comfortable talking nerdy to. We also throw a hackathon once a year in May, where we have hundreds of people come out, and it's really, really fun. And we host events all the time. We partner with the League of Women Voters. We blog. We do lots of really fun stuff that, depending on what you're interested in, you can find a good subject matter counterpart. So if you care about flooding, if you care about the environment, if you care about fiscal conservative finances, like any of those things, you can find a project with Sketch City. And our goal, aside from advocating for open data and technology in public decision making, is to help people, learn about what government does, because the more that you work side by side with government employees, the more you realize how complicated and how their job is and how hard they work to get it done.
And just because we've tossed this word around a lot and we're assuming a little bit of knowledge for the viewers at home, can you tell us just briefly what is a hackathon?
Good question. A hackathon, I got this on repeat. Our hackathon is a 24-hour gathering of nerds to come together, form teams, and work on projects, prototype projects together, and then they get to present it to people from the city. Sindhu was a judge last year, along with the mayor, and several other people, and basically it's a really great way of sketching out what's possible. We've had hackathon winners that scrape sex trafficking ads to help Houston Police Department with their raids. We've had hackathon winners build that Adopt a Drain program, build an app to help you know when to take out your recycling. It can be from the trivial and annoying all the way up to the life and death situations. It's just a matter of what the participants are interested in, and our job is to help them connect with the right experts and build cool stuff.
And if you're the kind of person who really wants to get involved but don't have some unique idea about what you want to do, is there a place for you?
There is. There's lots of things that you can do just to get oriented and to learn. You can help out a team with marketing and communications. You can help out a team with project management. We're tech folks. We work on the things that are interesting at the moment, but it's really helpful to have people who are working around the tech folks to help give it some shape, give it some messaging. And if you go to our website and look at our GitHub ideas repo, you can see dozens and dozens of ideas that we want to get off the ground. And I've got tons of them rattling around in my head right now that I don't want to take up the time to say, but we need teammates.
So I did not know until I started attending hackathons with you, Jeff, that it's not just a place for tech nerds. It is, in fact, a place for all nerds.
That's
so
true.
Can you talk a little bit about how somebody with no tech skill whatsoever might still be able to get involved?
For sure. So just watching people in technology work is enlightening. it's interesting to watch how people interact and how people delegate and self-assemble into teams. And so even if you don't know anything, you can join a team. There's stuff to do. Sometimes it's just getting water, or sometimes it's, learning to code or shadowing somebody and working in pairs. But it's a really good learning experience. So being a blank slate and feeling like you have no skills, it's actually the right place for you, because there's going to be plenty of people with skills and they want to help and teach.
Great. Well, I want to thank both of you for joining us tonight. This has been fantastic public affairs, public access conversation on open data with Sindhu Menon and Jeff Reichman. I just want to some final notes from the League of Women Voters of the Houston area, because it is now November. Don't forget to get out the vote. If you are curious what's on your ballot in terms of races and ballot initiatives, there are both this election season. You can check out our voter guide online at vote411.org. Search the races that affect you by zip code, and then head to the polls. There's also information about where to vote and the hours of the polling places, where they are, all that good stuff. Get out and vote. If you missed any portion of this episode and you want to see it later, you can check it out on Houston Media Sources YouTube channel. And we actually did curate some fantastic conversations about some of the races that are going to be on your ballot this election cycle. Not only the HISD Board of Trustees candidates, but also the HCC Board of Trustees candidates. If you're interested in those conversations, you can also find them on Houston Media Sources YouTube channel. On behalf of the League of Women Voters of the Houston Area Education Fund, I'm Rita Hicks saying thank you for joining us and have a good night.